The first mistake almost never looks like a mistake. It usually happens on the prettiest plant in the garden. The leaves are dark, almost glossy. Fresh flowers keep opening. New stems seem to appear every few days. You look at it and think, this one isn't slowing down anytime soon. So you stop paying attention. A week passes. Nothing dramatic changes. You still see green. You still see flowers. You still see growth. But when you reach into the vines, there are somehow fewer tomatoes than you expected. That's the part that fooled me. The plant never looked tired. It simply stopped making the same promises. Every hot afternoon takes something. Every warm night takes a little more. Nothing you would notice standing on the patio. Just tiny withdrawals, one after another. The strange part is that tomatoes rarely announce this decision. No yellow leaves. No collapsing stems. No obvious warning. A flower opens. Another quietly disappears. From a few steps away, they look exactly the same. Walk farther down the row. Another plant. Same variety. Same sunlight. Same rainstorm last Tuesday. Yet one keeps filling baskets while the other only keeps growing. At first, it feels like luck. Maybe better soil. Maybe better fertilizer. Maybe a stronger seedling. Then you watch long enough, and another pattern begins to appear. The busiest gardeners often respond the same way. More water. More fertilizer. More effort. Meanwhile, the most productive plants are often standing in quiet gardens where almost nothing seems to be happening. No emergency watering. No rescue feeding. No chasing problems. Just steady mornings. Steady roots. Steady growth. And week after week, another cluster quietly decides to stay. A tomato that starts turning red looks finished. Most of us stop thinking about it. It already made it. Right? Look a little closer. Run your hand under the cluster. The fruit is still firm, still heavy, still quietly changing every afternoon. The sun reaches the leaves. Within minutes, sugar begins moving through the stem. Some slips underground. Some disappears into fresh roots. Some finds flowers that haven't even opened yet. And some keeps flowing into tomatoes that already look ready for the kitchen. That surprised me. The reddest fruit in the garden is still asking for more. Another warm day. Another drink. Another little shipment of sugar. One tomato hardly changes anything. 5 barely matter. But by the middle of July, the vines can be carrying 20, sometimes 30, all waiting for the same delivery. Nothing looks different. The leaves stay dark. New flowers keep appearing. Even the tiny green fruit still shines in the morning light. Then one afternoon you notice something small. A flower that opened yesterday is already gone, 2 feet away. Another cluster never seems to grow. No yellow leaves. No disease. Just empty spaces where tomatoes should have been. That's the moment experienced gardeners reach for the ripest fruit. Not because it's sweeter, not because they're impatient, simply because the plant has been carrying it long enough. One tomato leaves. Something else quietly stays. You don't notice the change tomorrow. You notice it 3 weeks later, when another cluster is still hanging there. But here's the part I never expected. Keeping the fruit isn't always what slows the harvest. Sometimes the harvest is already moving exactly where it should, and still never arrives. The traffic problem comes later. The first black spot is almost disappointing. One tomato. Perfect on top. Dark. Smooth. Then you turn it over. A sunken patch the size of a coin. Most gardeners reach the same conclusion. I need calcium. Maybe. Maybe not. Walk into the garden the next morning. Nothing looks sick. Fresh flowers are still opening. The leaves still catch the light. Tiny green tomatoes are everywhere. So why is only one fruit collapsing? That's the part I never understood. Beneath the soil, thousands of tiny streams are moving upward every minute. Not fast. Not dramatic. Just water carrying whatever the roots manage to collect before sunrise. Some reaches the highest leaves. Some disappears into growing stems. Some is still climbing toward tomatoes no bigger than marbles. Then July arrives. 2 hot afternoons. A dry breeze. Soil that feels fine on top, but dusty an inch lower. Nothing wilts. Nothing falls over. You walk past without noticing. Inside the plant, one of the youngest tomatoes simply waits. Morning becomes afternoon. Afternoon becomes evening. The delivery never quite catches up. Days later, the black spot appears. Not where the journey started, where it quietly ended. That's why experienced gardeners rarely panic after seeing blossom end rot. They don't stare at the fruit. They kneel beside the soil. One slow watering, a layer of mulch. Another ordinary morning that keeps the roots from rushing. Most of the time, that's enough. The next cluster keeps growing as if nothing happened. But then something even stranger shows up. The soil stays moist. The roots stay healthy. The fruit keeps forming. And somehow, the plant still begins running out of air. The biggest tomato plant on the street isn't always the one carrying the biggest harvest. I've walked past that mistake more than once. From the driveway, it looks incredible. Dark leaves, thick stems, not a single empty space. The kind of plant that makes people slow down and look. Then you step closer. The air changes. Not much. Just enough to notice. It feels warmer under the leaves. Still, almost heavy. Reach into the bottom of the plant. Your fingers come back damp. The sun has been up for hours, but the lower leaves never seem to dry. That's when something starts feeling wrong. Nothing looks diseased. Nothing looks damaged. Everything looks almost too healthy. A bee disappears into the middle of the plant. For a second, you can't even see where the inside has become its own little weather system. Cool shade, trapped moisture, hardly any moving air. And a tomato plant notices that long before we do. Maybe you've done this too. You see a huge green plant and decide to leave every leaf alone. More leaves, more sunlight, more tomatoes. It sounds perfectly reasonable. Then August arrives. The baskets stay lighter than expected. Meanwhile, another plant a few feet away looks almost unfinished. You can see straight through the lower stems. Morning light reaches the soil. A breeze slips in and disappears out the other side. Nothing about it looks impressive. Until harvest day. That's why experienced gardeners rarely remove armfuls of leaves. They quietly lift away a few from the bottom. Just enough for the first breeze of the morning to pass through. Nothing dramatic happens. No overnight explosion of tomatoes. Only a plant that wakes up dry instead of damp. And week after week, one keeps growing a harvest. The other keeps growing a jungle. From the sidewalk, they still look exactly the same. Some tomato plants never make you worry. Not for a second. Even in late July, they look almost unreal. Dark leaves, thick stems, fresh growth pushing out every morning. People stop at the fence. They point. They smile. If mine looked like that, you probably would too. Then August arrives. You carry out the basket, reach through all that beautiful green, and somehow come back with 4 tomatoes. A few feet away, another plant looks almost ordinary. You can still see sunlight touching the soil. The stems aren't nearly as thick. There are gaps between the leaves. Nothing about it wins a gardening photo. Yet the basket keeps getting heavier. That contrast bothered me for years. The prettier plant kept growing. The quieter plant kept producing. Walk closer. The beautiful one is still busy. Another stem, another branch, another flush of leaves so soft they almost glow. Everything points upward. Everything says, keep growing. The other plant looks different. The newest growth has slowed. The flowers stay. Tiny green tomatoes keep holding instead of disappearing. Nothing dramatic. Nothing exciting. Just one small promise after another. By mid-August, the difference is impossible to ignore. One plant spent the summer becoming impressive. The other spent the summer becoming useful. Maybe that's why experienced gardeners rarely celebrate the biggest tomato plant in July. They notice the one that quietly stops reaching for the sky. A little less rich feeding, a little more room for fruit. No big rescue, no secret fertilizer, just fewer reasons to keep building leaves. And almost without warning, the baskets begin catching up. The strange part? The biggest harvest loss often starts with the healthiest looking plant. And the next thief is even harder to notice. It begins as the smallest branch in the entire garden. By now, a pattern starts showing up. Nothing has gone terribly wrong. The soil still looks fine. The leaves are still green. The roots are still working. And somehow, the basket keeps getting lighter. Then you notice something you've walked past 100 times. Right where a leaf meets the stem, a tiny shoot is reaching upward. Soft enough to snap between 2 fingers. Easy to ignore. Maybe you've looked at one and thought, I'll leave it for now. So did I. Come back a week later. It isn't a little shoot anymore. It has its own leaves, its own growing tip, its own flowers getting ready to open. For a second, it almost feels like free tomatoes. Then you look lower. A flower that was there yesterday is gone. A marble-sized fruit never gets any bigger. Nothing dramatic. Nothing dies. The plant simply starts spreading itself thinner. The strange part? The roots never agreed to any of this. They're still pulling the same water, the same minerals. The same sunlight still lands on the same patch of garden. Only one thing changed. The waiting line got longer. That's why experienced gardeners don't spend July making big corrections. They stop for a few quiet seconds, find the smallest sucker, pinch it away before it asks for more. No ladder, no fertilizer, no weekend project. Just one tiny decision almost too ordinary to notice. Vague slaughter. The difference shows up in the basket instead of the leaves. That's the kind of mistake gardens make all the time. Not loud ones. Small ones repeated until August. And once you start seeing them, the whole season begins looking different. Because one final decision is still happening every single day. You just can't see it yet. Late August tells on every garden. Across the fence, a hose drags through dry grass. Someone is watering again. Another scoop of fertilizer disappears into a bucket. Another afternoon spent trying to catch up. You step outside, coffee in one hand, an empty basket in the other. The first tomato comes away almost by accident, still warm from yesterday's sun. Another is hiding behind a leaf. Then another. You stop counting. For a moment. Nothing about the morning feels important. That's the strange part. Nobody watching from the sidewalk would guess the season was decided weeks ago. Back when the soil still felt cool. Back when every leaf looked healthy. Back when that tiny sucker was soft enough to pinch away without thinking. Back when a flower quietly stayed, instead of quietly disappearing. None of those mornings felt different. You would have forgotten every one of them. Until now. The basket is heavier, the plant is calmer, and somehow the work feels smaller. Walk through the garden one more time. You notice different things. A leaf that's already dry. A breeze moving through the lower stems. Sunlight touching the soil before breakfast. Tiny details. Easy to miss. Easy to ignore. But all summer long, they've been telling the same story. The plant was never waiting for a miracle. It was simply responding to the days it was given. Maybe that's why experienced gardens feel so quiet. Nothing dramatic. Nothing urgent. Just ordinary mornings. Repeated often enough that August quietly becomes something else. Not a rescue. A result.